So everybody, welcome to the session on law. We are going to follow a modified super fast TED Talk format today. So we have a very full panel. We have 6 speakers, include 5 there and plus 1. And we're going to have 3 8-minute talks in the order that we're going to follow the order in my introduction, and then stop for 15 minutes of questions about those talks. We'll then have 3 more 8-minute talks, stop for 15 minutes of questions specific to those talks. If we are efficient, and I'm hoping to keep us efficient and on time, then we'll have a couple of minutes at the end to ask questions for the whole panel. Okay, so welcome. Thank you so much for coming. Netta's going to lead us off. So Netta, lead us off.
So I hope I get it right. So thanks, Jim, and good morning, everyone. Today I want to talk about law, norm conflicts, and behavioral insights. So we live in a world in which values and norms constantly conflict, even in Western, democratic, and generally pluralistic societies. So just during the past year, we've seen several such highly publicized examples. So we've seen the conflict over same-sex marriage here in the US evolving into businesses refusing service, businesses in the wedding industry, to gay couples, and even a county clerk refusing to register these marriages. In both these instances, religious norms and beliefs conflict with anti-discrimination law and norms. A recent Supreme Court decision left hanging another very lengthy norm conflict in which religious employers refuse to comply with a law that requires employee health care policies to include contraceptive coverage. And the questions that arise from this case are particularly interesting from a behavioral perspective, because at least at this point in the dispute, all parties seem to agree that the government should afford some accommodation to religious employers, but the crucial question that we seem to not be getting right time and time again is what accommodation can actually work to satisfy both the compelling interest of the government in ensuring equal and free health care to all women and the religious concerns on complicity in sin. So while many of these conflicts pit competing beliefs and norms about gender and sexuality, the scope of conflict is even broader than that. So we also know conflicts about and over education, including teaching de-evolution or creationism. And in Israel, Britain, and Belgium, Jewish ultra-Orthodox schools demand exemptions from laws that require them to teach students a basic curriculum of math, science, and English, claiming that these subjects conflict with religious education. So how to solve these conflicts is a pressing item on many lawmakers' agenda. So these are all salient examples. Can behavioral science help overcoming these conflicts? So in recent years, behavioral scientists have become increasingly more engaged with this question and also have begun to outline some of the main barriers to conflict resolution and even unearth some promising interventions. And this is a really relatively new field of research, and there is still much work ahead of us. So today I want to focus on just one key idea, and that is that affirming people's values has the potential to mitigate norm conflicts and encourage peaceful resolution. And because this might sound a little bit counterintuitive, before I discuss some several examples, let me first say a little bit more about the concept of affirmation. So in social psychology, affirmation refers to conditions that increase individuals' sense of self-worth, identity, and narrative. In the lab, affirmation is often achieved through asking individuals to identify and then write about values that are personally important to them. Stanford's Jeffrey Cohen, who pioneered much of this work, finds that individuals who are reminded of their big picture values like family and friendship in this way often feel more confident and more empowered. As a result, they become more open to evidence and arguments that challenge their beliefs, more pragmatic, and when they negotiate with the other side, they also achieve more practical gains and compromise more. So how do these important findings relate to these conflicts of norms and values I opened with? So at the heart of many of these conflicts is a concept we call identity threat. Yielding to a norm that stands against your central beliefs and values risks your sense of identity and can also harm your ties with the community that you care about the most. As part of my research, I interview Catholics in the US and Jewish Orthodox in Israel. And what I often hear from these people is that what troubles them most about the laws they're fighting against is not necessarily the specific legal requirement to provide contraceptive coverage or teach math at school, but how they perceive these laws as posing a bigger threat to their religious identity. For example, I find that many ultra-Orthodox parents would actually like to educate their children in math and science, but they fear that what the government is actually getting at, attempting to do at least, is to eradicate their unique religious identity. And what the theory of affirmation then teaches us is to overcome these norm conflicts, people may need to feel that their identity is assured and that solutions to the conflict are not imposed on them. To make difficult decisions, they need to feel affirmed. In one revealing example in the context of international conflicts, social psychologists find that self-affirmed Israelis and Serbs were significantly more likely to acknowledge responsibility for in-group wrongdoing and to support reparations from victims for the other side. In my own research on religion-based conflict, I found that affirmation by the government can do a great deal to mitigate religious identity threats. So in one such experiment I'm going to describe now that I conducted in Israel, several hundreds of ultra-Orthodox participants read one of several versions of a government letter addressed to an ultra-Orthodox school containing details of the math and science curriculum, alongside a reminder that failing to teach this curriculum would result in budget cuts. The control version was adapted from formal government documents and used the same heavy-handed language that the government currently uses. The affirmation version added only a few extra words, but these words slightly changed the tone of the letter to acknowledge the identity of the school and the value of religious studies next to science. Participants in both conditions were asked whether they would support their children's school teaching the curriculum and whether they think that the school would actually teach it. The study had two important findings. First, as expected, many ultra-Orthodox participants want schools to teach the science curriculum. For the moderates in the ultra-Orthodox community, affirmation didn't matter much at all. They want the curriculum under both conditions. But for the conservatives, the group that is least likely to accept the curriculum, affirmation made a big difference. 100% of this group refused to accept the teaching of the curriculum in the control condition, but 50% thereof were between neutral and higher towards support in the affirmation condition. And what's interesting about it is that we might have expected affirmed individuals to become actually more hardline and entrenched in their positions, but the opposite occurs instead. They become more open to the policy and to the law change. The simple takeaway message is this: while there is still much research to be done for interventions that could mitigate norm conflicts, whenever identity threat is on the line, affirmation is definitely one solution worth trying. Thank you.
see here. I can't see. I can't see on this screen. Oh, great. So I'm going to speak about, in a sense, a chapter from a forthcoming book. It's called The Law of Good People, and I'm going to speak about the neglected role of behavioral ethics within the behavioral analysis.
Try the keyboard.
The other way around? Oh, okay. Oh, probably the Hebrew English. Okay. The behavioral analysis of law, we're basically challenging the rational choice perspective in law on a few grounds. We have, I think, the most famous one is kind of the Tversky and Kahneman, cognition, the whole biases, and heuristic literature. We have the legitimacy, I think mostly with Tom Tyler's work, that people care about procedure, not just about outcomes. And we have kind of people who not just care about their own self-interest, but also about others. And in a sense, I want to argue that there is a huge literature, it's a growing one in management and in psychology, which is kind of the blind spot, bounded ethicality, a different strand of this behavioral ethics focus on self-deception, self-maintenance, more kind of deliberative processes. But in a sense, it's kind of focusing on people's inability to fully capture their own wrongdoing as something which should be a very central component of the behavioral analysis law. But it seems that although it's really growing and being very successful in management and in psychology, it's not, and you can see kind of how many books on these kind of issues in psychology and management, you don't see that happening in law. And I think this literature really creates a lot of normative and prescriptive challenges for law. For example, if you have egotism, so is that a conflict of interest for someone to interview someone with the same first name? Or if you think about moral forgetting, so when you talk about responsibility, and the work suggests that people are more likely to forget rules which are not in line with their self-interest. We have in law this notion that if two people sign a document, it makes it more likely or less likely to be fraud, but we have behavioral ethics research suggest people might be more likely to cheat when they do it together. Rational choice expects that people will cheat more for themselves. They might be getting the gain for being corrupted in a sense, but the research suggests again that you will do more corrupt things for others. There is overwhelming evidence, and really don't have the time to develop it, that system one, that is the idea that people are not really aware of what's motivating them, is actually a huge component in people's ethical behavior. Situation matters, we know from social psychology, but I think again, behavioral ethics making really nice kind of illustrations of how really small tweaks in a situation can affect people's ethicality. And again, it's created a lot of challenges for law. So in a sense, if a lot of the bad things that we see are actually done by good people, what are the changes we need to do in law, in the theory, in terms of people's moral agency, responsibility, how should we treat choice, and in terms of kind of the interventions, the regulation, enforcement, if someone doesn't feel that they're doing anything wrong, obviously, for example, increasing the punishment is not likely to change the behavior of someone thinking, I'm not the corrupt person thereafter. So I think to understand why behavioral ethics is not that important in law, I think it's related to the contribution of economics. And I think in a sense, I'm calling it the double-edged sword of economics. Without economics, law and psychology, I think, will still focus on things like child custody, insanity defense, which are very important topics, but are not usually relevant for most type of people, and usually leaving private law, public law, many kind of the aspects of law outside the reach of psychology. So I think economics has done really great in that regard, but it also comes with a cost. And for example, if we think of something like self-serving biases, because of the dominance of economics in law, self-serving usually will focus on how people will overestimate the probability of winning rather than on people actually not figuring out that they did anything wrong, which I think is a more fundamental aspect of law. We should also say that in contrast to the more traditional behavioral economics, behavioral ethics is not as developed. So there are many important issues that are still kind of debatable in the current research about people's awareness. Can they actually change their behavior, and kind of the distribution of good and bad people in society? And just kind of one of the many questions that we still don't know. And the question is, should we wait for the field to kind of be more established? And in a sense, the argument, or this is what I'm trying to say, that we cannot, but you just need to do it more carefully. A related point is kind of, okay, now that we say that ethicality is important, I think we need to recognize that lawyers should play a kind of bigger role in the kind of behavioral insight teams that are emerging now in many countries, and in a sense that if you're only trying to kind of help people save more for pension, you could say that maybe you don't need kind of the legal background, but if you think of things like corruption, I think the normative issues are much greater. We also need to recognize that you cannot really take the cheating experiments that we see in behavioral ethics, you cannot really translate them directly to law without recognizing that people's decision to not obey the law, to comply, and all those things related to various legal instruments are different than cheating, and there is a work to be done to kind of think how to translate what we know about cheating to compliance, and I will demonstrate it in one slide at the end. I think there is a very big difference between ethical nudges and kind of traditional nudges in a sense that when it comes to ethical nudges, people, in a sense, like to be in some sort of an ignorance about their wrongdoing, so the nudge is not really in their self-interest. When you focus on nudges in people's health, people want to be healthy, so the nudge helps them do something they also are interested in. There are very many, I think, many important differences between what states can do and what organizations do, what they care about, what's their interest. And this is just the illustration that I mentioned before. So we have this notion of loss aversion, which is one of the established kind of prospect theory of Tversky and Kahneman. And there was some work done that because the difference between how people experience losses and gains, if you want to cause people to work harder, you will design it in a kind of a loss frame, then people will try to perform the contract better. And there is some experimental evidence for that in kind of what's called empirical legal studies. In the work that I've done with Teichmann and Schur, we showed actually that if you take vague contracts, so if people can come up with more than one interpretation, actually we see the reverse effect. So we asked people in the lab to do a reasonable mixture of hard and easy questions. They get the same bonus for every correct answer, but half of them got nothing and got 1 extra shekel for every correct answer, and half of them got 20 shekels and lost 1 shekel for every mistake. So from an economic perspective, it's the same. And what we found that people kind of interpret what's reasonable means differently if they were either in the loss or the gain condition. So in the gain condition, out of 20, they thought that 7.32 hard question is a reasonable question. So 13 easy on average and 7 hard questions. When you focus on the loss, their interpretation really changed. So it's 3 hard questions and 17 easy ones. So in a sense, just kind of taking the behavioral ethics perspective tells you that it's not, you cannot just take behavioral economics and use it in law without actually recognizing the other kind of type of more ethical biases that people will use, which will cause them actually, in a sense, to perform not as good from the perspective of the other side of the contract. Basically, when we speak about ethical nudges, I think we need to take into account the trade-offs, especially in terms of people's awareness to morality. And I think if we don't do that, we're going to use a lot of many important theories in terms of the expressive values of law, the sustainability, the legitimacy of law, the kind of educating people to virtue, the effects of law on moral identity. And I think, again, a lot of research suggesting that even with all those ethical unaware biases, people with higher moral identity, with higher intrinsic motivation are less likely to suffer from those biases. Thank you.
Which button is it? This one. Okay, so is this one? Okay, great. Okay, hi everyone. My name is Rosanna Summers, and I'm a graduate student in law and psychology at Yale University. I'm very excited to be here to present some of my research on legal versus lay understandings of the concept of consent. So let's dive right in with a topic that has fascinated me for the past year or so, which is the relationship between deception and consent. So the legal view is fairly straightforward. With a few exceptions, the view is that deception invalidates consent. That is, if you agree to something because you were lied to, you're generally not considered to have given valid consent. So if I enter into a contract with you due to your fraudulent misrepresentations, that contract would be voidable. The theory behind this is fairly straightforward. It's the idea that consent is an expression of your autonomy, and you can't enact your autonomy if you've been lied to about what it is that you are choosing between, essentially. So what I've been looking at in my research project is whether people who don't have any legal training agree with this concept that fraud would vitiate consent. I've been giving participants on Amazon Mechanical Turk various scenarios in which one party deceives another party about a fact that's material to the other party's decision making, and I'm asking them, was that consent? So to give you an idea of what I've been doing, here's a vignette from one of my studies. I'll read it to you and you can decide whether you think it's consent. So this is a picture of Marvin and his doctor, and the scenario goes like this. Marvin has been in physical therapy for ankle pain and is contemplating undergoing elective surgery to repair the tendon. He cares deeply about whether the surgery is covered by his insurance. He would refuse to have the surgery if he would have to pay out of pocket. Marvin's doctor knows this and lies to him. He says Marvin's insurance will cover the procedure when really the doctor knows that Marvin will need to pay out of pocket. Marvin says yes to the surgery. So we have a patient, he's expressed a fact that's material to his willingness to engage in this invasive medical procedure, which is elective. Doctor knows that, doctor lies to him. So I asked participants, okay, did Marvin consent to the surgery? As a show of hands, who here thinks that Marvin consented to the surgery? Okay. For those at home who can't see, 0 people raised their hand. Oh, 1 or 2, maybe. So I gave participants a sliding scale anchored at 50. They could slide it all the way down to 0 if they thought it was absolutely not consensual. They could slide it up to 100 if they thought it was very absolutely consensual, or any number in between. And here's the data. Each bar here represents one person's response, and I've arranged them in order from the lowest answers, all the zeros, to the highest answers, all the 100s. So you can see what all 97 people said. And as you can see, about 2/3 of people think that this surgery was more consensual than not, and the most common response, given by about 1/3 of people, is to see it as sort of unambiguously 100 consensual. The average here is 67. I also asked participants, okay, if you had to vote as a juror in this case, would you say that this doctor committed battery by performing this operation on Marvin? And consistent with the idea that Marvin consented, most people say no, it's not a battery. Why? Because Marvin consented. I've also looked at scenarios about sexual consent, where one party deceives another about a fact material to their willingness to proceed. So this is a scenario about Kevin and Anne. The scenario goes like this. Kevin wants to sleep with Anne. Anne has said that she does not want to date or sleep with any man who is married. When she asks Kevin whether he is married, he lies and says no, even though he is married. Under these circumstances, Anne sleeps with Kevin. Okay, so did Anne consent to sleep with Kevin? Most people say, yeah, that's consent. It's not even really a hard question for most people. I can ask the question in different ways besides just, was it consent? I can ask, did Anne autonomously authorize sex with Kevin? Did she give valid consent? Did she give permission? Did she freely, voluntarily choose to sleep with him of her own free will? And in all the ways that I've tried to ask it, people are largely saying, yes, this was an autonomous decision by this person, despite the fact that she was deceived about something that she had previously announced was important to her decision. I've also looked at other scenarios, consent to search by police who lie about what they're looking for, consent to participate in research when the investigator lies about the research, consent to the terms of a contract, a couple is buying a house, the seller lies about whether the house has a termite problem. Is that consent? And basically in over 24 scenarios, we're way over the midpoint at 50. People think it's consent despite the presence of material deception. I've tried scenarios with male victims, with female victims, where the surgery ends in an injury to the patient contracts an infection. The findings hold true across the board. My most recent study has looked at how people would interpret a case where one party has HIV, knows he has HIV, lies to his prospective sexual partner about his HIV status, and actually infects her with HIV. And even in that case, 50% of people think that the sex was consensual. So even in very extreme cases, people don't necessarily agree with this canonical legal view that deception vitiates consent. In fact, a majority appear to reject it, and about 1/3 appear to reject it pretty strongly. So the second question I've been looking at in my research is why? Why is this the case? Some qualitative research from when I've asked participants to please elaborate on why you do or don't see consent in these situations has revealed 2 prominent themes. The first theme is what I call victim blaming. It's this idea that you consented because it's your fault that you didn't seek independent verification about this thing that mattered to you. Instead, you trusted blindly, so it's your fault you consented. So I'll read some quotes from participants that speak to this theme. Here's one. In the end, it was up to Marvin to make sure the surgery was covered by his insurance. Rather than blindly trusting the doctor, he could have easily checked with his insurance company to make sure he would not be paying anything out of pocket. Marvin's a big boy. He should have taken it upon himself to find out. Here's a quote from someone who read the HIV scenario. Of course the sex was consensual. Allison chose to believe this man and got burned. She should be held accountable for her decisions. She could have made him get tested first and show her the results. Remember, he lied to her about his results. She could have waited and gotten to know him better before sleeping with him. She had a lot of choices and options, but she chose to trust blindly. And honestly, I think she deserves to get HIV for being such a fool. Okay, so that's the theme of victim blaming. That's the idea that it's your fault. You consented because you were foolish enough to believe what someone else said. Okay, the second prominent theme is this idea that I know you were deceived about something that mattered to your decision making, but in a really significant way, you were still free. You were still autonomous. You still had a choice which you made, and that to me is consent. So here are some quotes that demonstrate this idea, which by the way goes against like all of normative ethics dating back to Aristotle, dating back to Immanuel Kant, who say that if you're deceived, you can't voluntarily enact your will because you don't know what you're choosing between. But here's what participants say. They say, just because Anne had false information, she still had a choice, which she made. While it is true that she would have chosen differently had she known the truth, that doesn't remove Anne's freedom of choice. Here's another one. She consented. She still could have said no. He didn't take that choice away by lying. So it's this sense that I know you were deceived. I know you were deceived about something that you had previously said mattered to you, but that's still autonomy and it's still consent to me. So in summary, it seems that across numerous contexts, medicine, sex, searches by police, research by investigators, and consenting to contracts, people see high levels of consent, despite the presence of material deception and despite the fact that the person who's lying knows that his lie is essential to the other person's willingness to proceed. I've also found that judgments about the legal consequences of the consent tend to track the judgments of consent. So you say, it's not battery because there was consent. It's not rape, there was consent, that sort of thing. So these judgments that there's consent do have, it seems, legal implications. So to wrap up, I just want to point out that it seems like we've assumed that lay people will apply the prevailing legal definition of consent, but my empirical research has exposed a rift between the legal understanding of consent and lay understandings. And I hope that in the future, more empirical researchers will investigate whether concepts that are prevalent in law are accepted by people who have no legal training. So thank you.
I ask y'all to keep a 15-minute clock now for questions. We've got questions for these three speakers. Yes, sir.
Yeah, a question for Rosanna. I was just wondering, I'm not familiar enough with the Amazon Mechanical Turk process to know, but I was just wondering, is there any demographic data in there that allows you to shed any light on whether there are differences across income, cultural background, or other potentially material relevant factors?
Sure. Maybe I'll repeat the question for people who are listening through the recording. So the question was about Amazon Mechanical Turk and whether the demographics of MTurk shed light on who's saying this, who's not, or maybe even whether they're different from the general population. So it's true that MTurk is not like nationally representative. These are people who take online surveys basically in exchange for money. They tend to be a little bit younger, more liberal. I think there's a gender difference, but I'm actually forgetting whether it's more male or more female. It's interesting for me because to the extent that we have politically conservative participants in these studies, they actually see even higher levels of consent than the more liberal participants do. So to the extent that my research is not representative perfectly of the country, I think I'm actually underestimating the extent to which people feel that deception cases are consensual.
So what I'm wondering is, within the data set that you have, those relationships, they show up, and are they generally consistent with what you'd expect?
Yes, so the question is, within the data that I have, are there sort of demographic differences? So the ones that are, I think, most robust, I've done 25 scenarios or so, would be conservative versus liberal. So conservatives see slightly more consent than more politically liberal participants. And also with the sexual cases, but not the others, we have a gender difference where women see less consent when a person is deceived into having sex, essentially. But that gender difference isn't necessarily there with consent to the police searching your house and things like that. Thanks.
If you ask people what it is that they mean by consent, because I think consent is a legal term, as you described it, makes a great deal of sense. But if you just ask me, maybe on the street, did I consent to something? I might think, well, did I for myself make a decision, right, or something like that. So I think it's there may be implicit assumptions that we're making about what the consent implies, culpability, responsibility, et cetera. Whereas for people, it might simply imply, was there a decision point in their process, as opposed to somebody jumping on them in the street and grabbing them, right? Something like that.
Great question. So the question is, I take it to be something like, did you ask people what their understanding of consent is? Could it be that when they're answering these questions, they're sort of just saying whether a decision was made, and they're not necessarily thinking through whether it has legal implications or moral sort of normative force? It's a great question. It's one I've struggled with a lot. It's actually really hard to get people to answer the normatively important question of, did this person waive their rights? Should the other person get in trouble for what they did? Because of course, the person who we're asking about getting in trouble has done two things. They've cut open someone, ostensibly without their permission, and they've told a lie. So there's kind of a confound there. I would call it, it's a methodological challenge. But I think the data that speak most to this, I didn't have time to present, but I've done some studies where I compare a person who's been threatened and therefore agrees to do something because they're afraid of the threat. So it's instead of Kevin lying to Anne about being married, he's threatening to spread a secret of hers, and if she won't sleep with him. And so Anne agrees because she's scared about her secret being spread. And in those cases, you have a person who's deciding, yes, I'll do this. And they say yes, and they think yes, and they want it in a certain type of way. They want to have sex in order to avoid the worst fate. But people there don't think it's consensual. It's about it flips, basically. The average judgment is something like 30. And so I think that what that shows is that there's something about lying specifically that makes it seem volitional, makes it seem consensual, that's not there with threatening. And philosophers or the people who study this stuff haven't gotten there on what that thing is. What is it? In what way does a person who's lied to agree in a way that agreement, why is that morally relevant? What are people latching onto that makes them feel that this is autonomous? There's no theory there, so I'm now trying to work on trying to develop what that theory could be. Thanks.
Along these lines, have you looked to see whether if you explain the legal definition of consent to lay people, if they then adjust their judgment sufficiently?
I have not yet done that. In fact, Netta was suggesting that I do that just last night when we were practicing. I think it's an important next step. I think it's probably the next study I'll run. It's interesting if you look at other research on giving people either jury instructions or definitions about things that they have strong moral intuitions about. It's often the case that you can't get them. I mean, they say the same thing. So Dan Kahan, who's a professor at my school, at Yale Law School, he's done a study where he manipulates sort of the standard, the liability standard for rape cases, strict liability, or other standards, and basically he finds that it's really hard to push people around, even with really explicit instructions about what you're supposed to be focusing on, and he says because they're implying an intuitive moral concept as opposed to following instructions. So it would be interesting to test. It'd be great if we could get consent judgments to go down, but previous research suggests that might not happen.
One more question for Rosanna. I apologize. I think it's because she was the last one to present. But as a tag on to a couple of the last comments that were made, if a person, and again, it's this legal versus the layperson view, if a layperson listens to the question or they read the question and they're thinking of it intuitively or maybe even very inwardly reflecting on it, so they put themselves in the shoes of this person instead of thinking about Marvin or thinking about whomever, they actually say, if this happened to me, would I feel like I had given consent? Which I think a lot of people have a tendency to do in surveys. They apply their own reasonable person standards, so they think they're reasonable and they say, okay, if this happened to me. And I think there's something there too that you could study in the difference between the lie and the threat. Is that a reasonable person, if they think, well, I was lied to, but darn it, I should have, they may even victimize themselves in a bit, like I really should have asked more people first before I believed the doctor. I should have talked to the insurance company myself. Whereas if they're threatened, they're thinking it wouldn't have mattered who I talked to. I would still feel like I had to do that. In fact, who could I talk to? So it's that there's a nuancy thing going on there that I think would be interesting to study as well.
Yeah, it's a great suggestion. I'll repeat it, which is that it's sort of the idea that when people are responding to these scenarios about other parties and asked to make a determination, that they may be putting themselves in the shoes of the characters and answering how they would have felt or what they would have cared about, and maybe the difference between deception and coercion how people respond to those cases has something to do with that. I didn't have time to present this data either, but I did have one study where I manipulated what the person cared about, what his reasons were for not wanting this surgery, and I manipulated whether he cared or he didn't care. And basically what I found is it was a 2x2 design, so 4 cases. People thought it was consensual in most cases, but they thought it was super duper consensual when he cared about something that was kind of silly. He said, I didn't want to have the surgery if the surgeon wore gloves that were made of non-biodegradable plastic. You know, something kind of just really weird that I think a regular participant wouldn't relate to at all, whereas they might relate more to someone who was worried about their finances. So it does make a difference, but not enough to push the judgments sort of down where I think they should be, which is that this was not consensual.
For you, and you don't have to repeat it because I'm microphoned, which is I'm actually really depressed at a meta level by your findings. Not so much the specific finding and what you might use it for, but the fact that if I had been thinking about affirmation and what affirmation would do in the scenario that you were discussing, it would never have occurred to me that affirming a value of that type or an identity of that type would actually make people more willing to negotiate. And so I'm actually asking a meta question, which is, and what to me, what this shows, and one of the reasons I'm asking it, shows the value of the RCT in pulling apart these relationships and finding things that are counterintuitive. It shows potentially a nexus between behavioralism and randomization, randomized rigorous causal research. How does one go about dreaming up things like this? Because this seems entirely counterintuitive to me, that again, affirming an identity that is externally viewed as particularly rigid would not increase rigidity. It would instead make someone more willing to compromise.
Yeah, so to reverse engineer the structure, maybe the evolution of this research, so it started, I think I first got the idea for this study when I was doing the interviews. And first I saw that contrary to what I believe, just based on, as a lawyer, seeing the litigation, the legal arguments, the volume of public objection to the program, you would think that people are not interested in that. But then when you were interviewing educators and parents, you saw that they are interested in that, but they struggle with what would it mean to actually embrace it. And then some of them were suggesting something that I later tested in an experiment, which just struck me as an application of framing. So they said, let's not call it school. Let's say that it's an extracurricular activity rather than the core curriculum. And then we'll be fine with it. If you do it after school hours in the same location, we don't mind government teachers, but just don't call it the curriculum, call it extracurricular. And so then it occurred to me that it could be a really small tweak, like a really small behavioral framing of the question that might do something good. And just based on the general insights I got from my interviewees, I realized that the concept of this identity threat is there, the framing might help, and then the affirmation literature seemed like something that could bridge those two ideas.
Maybe a very, very strong plug for qualitative research prior to quantitative research to figure out what's going on. So question, yes, sir. Mm-hmm.
So yet another question for Rosanna. You mentioned that you had some findings on what people had to say about culpability in those situations, that it largely tracked their opinions on consent. What I'm wondering there is, did you try asking those questions about fraud, culpability, harm, that sort of thing before priming them with questions about autonomy, free will, and that sort of thing? Or did those come subsequent to?
Yeah, so the question was about the ordering of the dependent variables, whether I ever asked questions about culpability before questions about consent, autonomy, and the answer is no. I've only asked the consent question first. Do you have a hypothesis about what would happen if you were to switch the order?
Well, yeah, I think that you'd naturally find that people, if you prime people on sort of the harm in the situation rather than whether or not they exercise free will or autonomy, that they're likely to see the situation differently.
Okay, so the response was you might see the situation differently if you got people thinking in a harm mindset first rather than a free will mindset. That might very well be true. I should probably run that. I think the reason I should say that I've asked the free will questions first is because I'm interested in consent, which I take and the literature takes to be important because of its relationship to autonomy. And you can you can fail to consent to something even if it doesn't harm you, or you can be harmed by something that you did consent to. So it would be interesting, but also not sort of morally correct or in line with the normative thinking that's been done if people were judging consent based on harm. They're supposed to be sort of separate. That's the reason why, if you have a religious objection to a blood transfusion, even if you need one to save your life, we can't just do one to you because it's your autonomy that is the central question. It's not just about what would harm you.
Just a question for Netta. I'm quite interested in the specific phrase that you used in the letter that had the effect. Can you talk us through that?
Yeah, so in the letter, there was an opening, and then there was one paragraph where I made the changes, which wasn't about the details of the program or about the sticks, so the budget cuts. And it just described the school. So it said, as you know, your school has to follow with this program and teach it along your other subjects of study. And the control version was pretty much that. And then I added, I think less than 10 words. It was in Hebrew, but so first, when I said, as you know, your school, so your school, I said that it's partially autonomous, which is true under Israeli law because they're religious schools. And then when I said that you need to add that to your program of study, then I said, so it's hard to translate it, but ultra-Orthodox schools, they don't call what they do religious studies, they call them holy studies. So I just added, so I said, your holy studies program, and then these subjects. Only these words were added.
We have time for one final question. Does anyone have a question for Yuval? No, right now, a question over here? Yes.
This is for Rosanna, I'm sorry. I know you mentioned while you were speaking, I don't know if this makes sense or not, about the experimental philosophy stuff that Josh Knobe has led. I wonder if, like, tweaking the question, like doing an RCT, where in one question, there's more of an emphasis on, like, the doctor intended to deceive, there's intent on the part of the person deceiving. I wonder if that would affect people's moral opinions. Just a thought.
So the suggestion was to do a randomized controlled trial where in one version it's emphasized that the doctor had intended to deceive, and in the other, I think, to just leave it ambiguous, and that you might see consent judgments go down if you were to emphasize the intent more. Yeah, it's certainly possible. I mean, the qualitative results suggest that people realize that there's intent. It's not that they're misreading or that it's lost on them, that they just don't see it as consent. They do see it as consent despite the fact that the person was sort of intentionally deceived. So I don't know what would happen. This research has surprised me at every turn, so yeah, it's an empirical question. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. And could you get a mic? We're going to move on to the second panel and just say, could you all transfer mics? Do you have a microphone on already? If you don't, once you get one up. Okay, you good? Okay. You won't be able to use that when you speak, though, will you? Because it's... Anyway. Ryan.
Good morning. My name is Ryan Bubb. I teach at NYU School of Law. And in my brief remarks today, I want to get you all thinking about mandatory disclosure. This is a legal technique that behavioral science is poised to transform. And what I'm going to do today is just outline 4 ways of thinking about the mechanisms through which mandatory disclosure operates. And what they imply about how to evaluate the costs and benefits of disclosure. So the traditional model of mandatory disclosure is based on a paradigm of informing choice. Individuals are capable choosers under this understanding, but simply lack all the information they need because of some sort of market failure. And so regulators respond by requiring sellers to furnish information. Query, how should we evaluate such mandatory disclosure? Well, a natural approach is to test consumer knowledge. And this is what regulators typically do, at least as a first step. But typically, this is all they do, which is to measure either in a focus group or other sort of laboratory setting consumers' knowledge prior to being exposed to the disclosure, and then after, to look for an improvement in their understanding. Importantly, this traditional paradigm for mandatory disclosure does not require the regulator to know anything about consumer preference. As long as the disclosure is improving consumer knowledge, it must be at least weakly beneficial, since we presume that then the disclosees, the consumers, will go about more effectively maximizing their preferences. Enter behavioral economics. There's, of course, now a huge body of research documenting that consumers are subject to various biases and cognitive limitations, and this has important implications for thinking about disclosure as a legal technique or as a regulatory technique. Dual process theory from cognitive psychology provides a very useful framework for this issue, among others, and I'll presume that most of you are familiar with this research and give it short shrift. But what I'd like to point out is that under the traditional model, most disclosures are designed for system 2 decision processes, so cognitive processes that are slow, deliberate, and effortful. So I'm going to call disclosures that are designed based on a system 2 cognitive process, system 2 disclosure. And in the first wave of sort of behaviorally informed reforms to mandatory disclosure, the main emphasis has been on simplifying disclosures to more effectively inform a decision to decision process. Most of us, after all, do not carefully sort through every decision we make, exhaustively gathering all of the information or carefully reading the entire disclosure presented to us prior to making a choice. We make choices in a far quicker manner, and the aim of the simplification approach to reforming disclosure is to boil down what we need to know into a simple summary form that is easy to digest and provided right at the moment of decision making. So for example, here's a calorie disclosure. So the regulator could have required the seller here to furnish at the point of sale all of the nutrition information potentially relevant to the decision about whether to eat one of these delicious donuts. But they did not. Instead, they required a summary disclosure, the number of calories in each donut, just to illustrate this, to fix ideas. So in this model, how should we think about evaluating the benefits and costs of disclosure? Well, not so differently than from the traditional model, since this is, after all, still rooted, this approach to simplifying System 2 disclosure is still rooted in an informed choice paradigm. In particular, what's done is typically, again, simply to test consumer knowledge, whether this calorie disclosure, for example, improves consumers' knowledge about calorie counts. And in a study a few years ago of required disclosures, calorie disclosures at Starbucks, the study found no statistically significant improvement in disclosees' understanding or knowledge of the calories in the various menu items. Nonetheless, they found about a 6% drop in calorie consumption per transaction. Okay. While System 2 disclosure has been the dominant disclosure paradigm, dual process theory suggests a different mechanism, different cognitive mechanism, through which disclosure could operate, which is by nudging System 1, that is, exploiting the various quirks that are more automatic and unconscious cognitive processes produced for decision making. And a growing literature advocates such an approach to disclosure. I'm going to call this approach System 1 disclosure, naturally. But the main approach that's been advocated has been in terms of debiasing disclosees' beliefs. So the idea here is if people make systematic mistakes in judging, for example, the risks associated with some product, then we could use a disclosure designed to exploit the availability heuristic, for example, to debias their beliefs, to make their beliefs more accurate. So again, to give you an example. So here's an example of a type of mandatory disclosure that has been argued to debias through exploiting System 1. The idea is that, so this is a cigarette package, as hopefully is obvious, and this is a graphic illustration of smoking-related illness on the package. The idea is that if most people underestimate the health risks of smoking, if we can make them view this salient, disturbing image of smoking-related illness, that might increase their assessment of the probability that they'll get sick from smoking, and thereby better inform their decision in weighing the costs and benefits of smoking. That's the paradigm. So I'm getting repetitive here, but once again, how do we evaluate the benefits and costs of this paradigm of disclosure? It's the same as the previous two. It's still, this debiasing through system one is still very much rooted in an informed choice paradigm. So long as seeing this disturbing image improves on average in some sense, or I'll just stick with it on average, improves on average in some sense consumers' beliefs about the risks associated with smoking, then it must be weakly beneficial. It's weakly improving consumer welfare by improving their decisions. Okay, so finally, a fourth paradigm. So I think the paradigm of informed choice and debiasing is not the best way to understand that cigarette disclosure, nor indeed most System 1 disclosures. Rather, these disclosures often aim to move behavior in a specific direction, not just beliefs. That is, they operate through channels other than the probability assessments of the disclosee. So back to our cigarette example. While this may indeed affect disclosee's assessment of health risks, surely it affects behavior through other channels, in particular through emotional channels that create a negative affect, a negative association with smoking. So let me wrap up. So how should we evaluate it then? There are two essential ingredients. First, we need an empirical analysis of disclosure's behavioral effects, not just its effects on beliefs. And then second, the harder part of it is we need a model of normative preferences, independent of preferences revealed through choice, that tell us whether those behavioral effects are good or bad. In other words, we need a paternalistic assessment by the policymaker of what's in people's true interests. This is a hard issue to solve, but I think much of the discussion in the sort of nudge field about disclosure sidesteps this critical issue. Thanks.
Hi, so I'm going to talk to you about consumer markets and consumer law. I want to divide my time into kind of a problem/solution format. And the problem here is that in many consumer markets, you can think of your favorite consumer markets, cell phones, credit cards, et cetera, these consumer markets are not operating as well as we would like. They suffer from what I will call a behavioral market failure. And then the solution part will be to ask, so what is the law doing about this, and is it working? So let me start with the problem. So what happens in these behavioral market failures is that we have consumers, and these consumers are imperfectly rational. And they're making mistakes. They're making predictable mistakes, and sophisticated sellers and service providers are responding to these mistakes strategically in their product design, when they're thinking about pricing structure, in their contractual design. That's why I call this seduction by contract. And in effect, what we see here is an interaction between consumer psychology on the one hand, market forces on the other hand, which exacerbates the implications of mistake and imperfect rationality. So how does this figure in consumer contracts? So this handsome gentleman over there is my good friend Omri Ben-Shahar, actually from the University of Chicago. He actually took the time to print out the iTunes contract and paste it together, and you can see there's a lot of fine print in the iTunes contract. And so the question is, what's hidden there? Why should we be afraid of this? Whether the law should intervene? And so a lot of things are hidden there potentially. Here is one. So you all have, I'm sure, frequent flyer programs. They might not always be what they seem to be. There might be some hidden conditions or qualifications in these programs, perhaps not as severe as this caricature displays, but still. Another example, fees that are hidden in the fine print, or maybe not even in the fine print. So this is an advertisement by Southwest. They're saying, look at our price and our competitor's price. They might initially look the same, but when you hold it up to the light, they will not look the same. Another example that we see in many consumer contracts is contingent fees. So we have add-on pricing. Think about, telephone, international calling, or room service in hotel services. Penalty fees. late fees, default interest rates, prepayment penalties and mortgages. These are all types of fees and prices that consumers might not fully understand, appreciate, might underestimate the likelihood of triggering them, and so forth. Rebates, that's a big example. And so here is a Dilbert cartoon. Instead of selling your product for $27 or $29, sell it for $1,029. And basically the idea is that all you need is one person to forget to send in their rebate forms, and you've made it. Okay? And so we will target the lazy rich, and that is the conclusion there. Another prominent example, teaser rates. In many markets, we have introductory prices or interest rates that are relatively low, sometimes 0% APRs. I'm sure you've seen that. And after a while, they go up to the post-introductory rates. The problem, of course, is that consumers, many consumers, as this ad suggests, do not switch after the introductory price expires, and therefore they end up paying high prices. Okay? And so there are many such examples in consumer markets and in consumer contracts. I think that most of them can be kind of put into one of two categories. One category, as exemplified by the teaser rate example, is what I call deferred cost. You pay a little bit now, but you will pay much more on the back end or later. Okay, and so because consumers are myopic or they're optimistic, they would not appreciate this fully. The second category is just complexity as a design feature. These contracts, these pricing schemes for consumers are very complicated. And it's very easy to hide things, to put in non-salient prices in this maze of complexity. Okay, so that is the problem. What is the law doing about this? There are several types of techniques or responses that the law is using. I'll just kind of quickly go through some of them. Ryan has already spoke about disclosure way better than I can, so I'm just going to wish through this. But just one thing to note, I might be a little bit more optimistic than Ryan about some of these simple aggregate disclosures, not where we're talking about calories, but when we're talking about financial products like consumer credit. If we can measure all the different sources of credit or sources of pricing of credit and put in something like the APR, it might do some good. Another type of regulatory tool still within the nudge toolkit is switching default rules. And we have seen some kind of prominent examples of this in the consumer context. We now have, in the checking account, we have moved from opt-out to opt-in. Banks have to opt you into overdraft protection. You can't just automatically be enrolled in this service. Similarly, for credit cards, the Card Act of 2009 said that you cannot simply automatically enroll people in over-the-limit protection on the credit card. It has to be an opt-in. And these have been kind of relatively successful with differences between the two, which we can talk about later if you're interested. Moving on to somewhat more kind of heavy-handed intervention, price caps. The economists in the room, I'm sure, are very, don't like price caps or price regulation altogether, but this is something that we see a lot in consumer markets. Okay, and the basic idea is, or one example here is, in credit cards, we have now a pretty strict limit on penalty fees or late fees in credit card contracts. Now, the problem with this type of intervention, or one problem with these types of intervention, is that these markets, these pricing structures are often multidimensional. And so when you cap one, there is a risk, or more than a risk, that another one will pop up. This is like the whack-a-mole problem in this context. But even though we have, or we can expect another price to go up, this does not mean necessarily that price caps are not helpful. In particular, if the price that is going down, that is capped, is a non-salient price, and as a response, a salient price goes up, then consumers might get a better sense of how much they're going to pay for this particular product or service. So this might be actually a good thing. Thank you. And finally, I want to talk to you about contract law itself. Okay, so this is the law that is implemented by courts when they're adjudicating contractual disputes, specifically between sellers and consumers. Now, in contract law, the first line of defense is assent doctrine, and this relates to the consent that Rosanna talked about. And usually we think in contracts that when two parties signify assent to a contract, that must mean that they're both better off. This is a Pareto improvement, this contractual relationship. Of course, the assumption here is that consumers know what they're assenting to, and I'll just remind you that Henri Ben Shahar in the iTunes contract, we don't really think that consumers understand or even know what they're assenting to. And therefore, this first line of defense, assent doctrine, is not doing a lot of work in the consumer context. Rather, we need to invoke other types of doctrines. And so one doctrine that we use, or the courts use in this context, is the unconscionability doctrine. And the way they use this is by identifying particularly harmful, one-sided, unfair terms in the consumer contract, okay, and then deciding not to enforce them. Okay? because they're unconscionable, specifically when these terms, this is on the procedural unconscionability prong over there, when these terms are thought to be non-salient, to be terms that did not affect consumer choice. Consumers were not aware of them or underestimated their importance. Okay, so this is the unconscionability doctrine. A second doctrine that is potentially powerful and effective here is deception doctrine. Okay, and so again, I'm a little bit an interesting conversation with Rosanna about the relationship between consent and deception. Usually, in contract law, as a legal matter, the court will say, yes, there was consent, but we're not going to enforce it because there was deception. So it's not necessarily that there was consent or there was not consent. And so the main issues of deception that we're worried about in the consumer context are situations where a seller would advertise a benefit of their product or service, again, in advertising or in a sales pitch, but then try to undermine it in the fine print. We will call this deception and fail to, or the court will decide not to enforce it. Or when you're hiding a charge in a multidimensional pricing structure, that might also fall under deception. And so let me just, my time is up, I'll conclude. The basic idea here in terms of the problem, there is a behavioral market failure in many of these important consumer markets. The law is trying different tools to get at that. We're still trying to fine-tune our approach. And of course, there's more to do. Thank you.
So I am mic'd up and thus able to move, which I will because I get really nervous if I have to stand still. So, want to ask a question, present some results of a literature search, basically, that I did with a co-author named Andrea Matthews, and ask the question, why is there no there in the field of law and randomized control trials, specifically with respect to the legal profession, not so much academia. Academia has embraced the randomized control trial in many ways as a knowledge-generating device, but the legal profession, by which I mean the bench and the bar, particularly I'm going to focus on the United States, has not. And so I want to take us back, what did I do? There, okay. I'm going to take us back, first of all, say why should we care about whether this is true? Who cares about it? And I think that this was part of the reason that I was asking the question to Netta, which is that to the extent as behavioralists, we are trying to focus on ideas that are not predicted by rational choice theory or an economic approach or a welfare maximization approach in some way, results or interventions that have certain effects. We need the randomized control trial to tell us what's going to be true or what's actually going to work. And again, ex ante in Netta's research, I would not have known which one of these effects would come from a identity affirmation exercise, such as the one she ran. And we need the randomized control trial to tell us what is going on there. And in law, we face a lot of these problems in the legal profession, in legal practice. And so that's why I think we should care. There are other reasons. So, okay, again, invite you to time warp back to 1935, which is where I mentioned in the introduction to this whole session. Would you have been able to tell, as an average person living in 1935, whether law or medicine was going to transform itself into a science, whether it was going to recognize a place for the randomized control trial in its what I call professional epistemology, in the epistemology in the sense of how do we get from here to there, what works, not epistemology in the sense of what's right, but instrumental rationality, how do we get from here to there. And I think the answer is you would have actually had a very difficult time telling which profession was going to transform itself. And now it seems really obvious which profession is doing it and what profession is a science as opposed to something else. And so if we think this is a bad thing, one thing I wanted to do in this particular research was say, how bad is it? And what can we do about it? Or at least begin the speculation about what we can do about it. And so my co-author and I, Andrea and I, embarked upon a search for as many RCTs as we could find within the United States legal profession. And we applied some definitions here. I have them up on the slide. I think the two sort of most controversial will be that the randomization needs to be something, randomization needs to have replaced a decision that would otherwise have been made by the professional. And so in the medical context, the randomization, the field experiment is replacing the decision of what drug to prescribe, typically. That's the classic drug trial model. And that would otherwise have been, or recommend, that would otherwise have been a decision made by a medical professional. And then it also needs to be done for the purpose of knowledge. So there's been prior research about how randomization is used in the legal profession, in the bench and the bar. And it turns out there's actually a fair amount of it going on. It's just not used for the purpose of gaining knowledge. So the classic example of this is randomization of judicial assignments to cases. And the reason we do that is not because we think we want to learn whether judges make a difference. In fact, when we study that, we as scholars study that, judges get really angry. They get very, very annoyed with us when we present them with rigorous empirical findings that show that a great deal depends on which judge is assigned. Instead, they say, well, everybody knows the cases are decided by facts and law. And you're like, what? There's an RCT here. It's not true. No, we know. Anyway, they go on randomizing. They do it for the purpose of appearance of fairness, primarily, so that nobody can accuse them of having manipulated. So this was what we were looking for when we decided. We do not think that we found them all. We are pretty sure we didn't. We know of a couple others in our list of 50 that we've already since discovered them. We're also, as you'll see, one of the things that we found was we found virtually nothing outside of litigation. And that makes us really nervous because it makes me think that we were looking about what we knew, since both Andrea and I are litigators. And we didn't really know how to search for things outside of litigation. But anyway, this is what we found, roughly 50-ish. My point is that suppose I'm off by a factor of, 1,000. And there are, in fact, 50,000 RCTs in the law. I still think that we are in a very different place in the law than we are in, say, the medical profession, which I'm using as my foil here. So what does it look like? Roughly 50-ish studies. One thing that we found, which kind of startled us, was that the studies are on a very wide range of subject matter. And so in a precedent-based profession, one dominated by, if it's been done before, it must be not just okay, but correct, it turns out that there are lots of precedents to be used. And I, in fact, have been deploying these precedents when I'm trying to persuade people to get involved in randomized trials. The publication venues are absolutely everywhere. And this was this made the search nightmarish. We found things just lying around, unpublished dissertations that were not available online. We found them through citations. Something stuck on a professor's website that had never been submitted for publication. It was done in like 1984. I have no idea how it made it to the web, because back in 1984, I was around then. They didn't have them internets. There was no field, there was no recognition that this is a thing, there was no recognition of the importance of the idea, et cetera. And so the claim that I'm making here is that the problem in the legal profession, at least in the United States, is worse than it is in other fields. I'm going to share an anecdote. There's a colleague of mine that is working for the Obama administration trying to get RCTs and new ideas into federal government agencies. He has succeeded in forming partnerships with every one of the major cabinet level departments except for the Department of Justice. He has also had absolutely no luck with the Administrative Office of the United States Courts. Just nobody will play ball with him. So, okay, if this is true, what does it tell us about the legal profession, and what could we do about it? So what does it tell us about the legal profession? I think it tells us that in terms of professional epistemology, there are basically two sources of instrumental truth. What I see day to day and what the cool people tell me is true. And I think that's bad. And what can we do about it? Why? We might begin by asking the question, what can we do about it? By why is it true? And then what can we do about it? Okay, so what can we do about it? Second, we don't really know. And I haven't had great ideas on this besides the really obvious one, which is more examples, for institutionalization, which I've been attempting to do by creating a little center, preaching, persuading funders that you have to start demanding this sort of thing before you'll fund. I mean, these are all sort of traditional. We don't have any new ideas on this at all, and I'd really welcome some new ideas on this. Why is it true? Maybe this would be a place to try to start with interventions. Well, there are a bunch of explanations that people have fed us, and the problem is they're all true of the medical profession, and they were all true of the medical profession back when medicine self-consciously changed. Medicine fought its bloody intellectual civil war to transform itself from a profession, in part, at least into partly a science. And so they won't really fly very much. And so we thought of others, and here are some various characterizations of the others. To us, they all come back to the idea of certainty, which is that there is something going on in the legal profession that makes us more certain and therefore less willing to confront the idea that we may not know everything that we need to know. We are omniscient in the legal profession, and in fact, judges need to be omnipotent, or else they don't feel like judges. And so maybe combating something, some intervention along those lines might work. So, thanks very much. I'm going to do a dual role as moderator and panelist. So questions for this panel start a 15-minute clock. And then if we should have just a couple of minutes to sort of throw it open and ask questions for anyone. Yes, ma'am.
I have a question mostly for Ryan, I think, about consent, because I'm working on privacy, and consent was one of the main tools that was studied from the legal perspective of what you can apply to try to solve this problem, why people share so much information, why they do these risky decisions with privacy. And scholars came to the conclusion that it's not a very effective tool, there is a failure of consent, and they were trying to solve it. And based on that, there are still nudges, techniques, can be one of the steps towards improvement of that. But still, there are so many things that are creating more questions than answers. For example, how to solve the habituation problem that, okay, you pop up once a window that says you something, you pop up twice, 3 times. First time, people don't even read on it, they don't look at it, they just accept everything. The same happens with the contract, so it's related also to the topic of another panelist. So it's one of the problems, the same with cigarettes example, do really people still scared about these pictures? Well, who smoked, continue smoking. Then the second question was that is, information is not actually always informative, because sometimes we give people information, but they don't know how to deal with it, or they don't understand it properly. Again, since I'm working privacy, this website plays cookies on our computer. Well, some people really think they're just biscuits and treats. Some people think that, oh, they're probably ads. They have misperception, and based on that, they make the decision that is actually not aligned with their preferences. And then even if they have information, they fail to assess probabilities and risks and losses and benefits, so they're not able to make all this calculus to make a real decision based on the information that you give. And the last one is, most of the time the consent is kind of take it or leave it offer, so they don't have a choice. They either comply with it, accept that, or just leave the platform, don't accept the product, don't accept the contract, the offer, whatever. So there is basically no choice based on that. So is it informative choice, or it's an informative, fact, accept it and go on?
So actually, let me ask you to conclude there and let Ryan answer the question. Ryan, maybe you could repeat the gist of the question for the...
I think we hadn't gotten to a sentence with a question mark, but we were on the way. Is there a sentence with a question mark at the end here?
Yeah, so how do you address these 3 problems? And to summarize, is the habituation problem and take it or leave it offers, and uninformative information.
And are you mic'd up?
I am. So the question, the context the questioner asked about is privacy policies, for example, websites that adopt a certain set of approaches to commercializing or not, protecting or not the private data that users give the website. And there's a set of studies that suggest that the standard policy paradigm, which is very much an informed choice paradigm, I think this is why the question was asked of me, the same informed choice paradigm that motivates the traditional model of mandatory disclosure, there's some evidence that suggests that doesn't work very well. So for example, people simply don't understand the issues that they're choosing, the options they're choosing among when deciding whether to give their data to a particular website under a given set of policies. And the question was, do I have a way to resolve that set of issues? So, no would be, I don't have any magic bullet. So to apply the thesis of my presentation to this question, the way I would encourage you to think about it is, as soon as you leave the paradigm of informed choice, then an essential part of a good evaluation of alternative policy options, which might involve nudges that shift behavior around through something other than simply informing choice and letting the users be, capable choosers with that information, or mandating certain policies on the part of companies. Once you move into that direction, even the set of nudges that move behavior around, to evaluate its benefits and costs, you need good evidence on its behavioral effects, but then B, and this is the much trickier one, some way to map behavioral effects into social costs and benefits, which requires some model of normative preferences. So one way to think about generating that would be to have an agency like the Federal Trade Commission in the US would be a natural regulatory body, to actually do research on the issues implicated by the different policy choices adopted by the Googles and Facebooks of the world, and have the FTC itself try and get estimates of the benefits and costs of more liberal or more strict privacy policies. But I say that as if it's an easy thing. It is not at all. It's an incredibly thorny and difficult thing to figure out.
Next question. Yep.
I'm from the UK's financial regulator, and we've been doing a whole bunch of RCTs on disclosure. And I guess first thing to say is, generally it's really hard to shift behaviour. The things that we found have been effective have been reminders and maybe small pieces of information, but then has small effects. So I guess first thing is, the way that I think we've been approaching things is to try to think from this sort of David Laibson or Matthew Rabin sort of perspective. Effectively, you're trying to get some, it may be loose, but some kind of structural model for how people are making choices and how they're making mistakes. You might ask for their ex-ante desires, their beliefs, maybe you ask for regret. You try to build up a pattern of what's going on. And is that how you're thinking about things? Are you thinking about things differently? And then the second question, which is something we're really struggling with, is once you're dealing with regulated markets, you can do stuff on the demand side. So in partial equilibrium, you can get an idea of what people can do. Of course, the supply side is going to respond, and you're going to have a whole bunch of changes. So if you're doing stuff related to switching, and you're looking at teaser rates, prices, and there's other things that could change as well, prices can adjust over time, so you can get very different cost-benefit analysis. How do you think about sort of dealing with those two issues?
Yeah, so one way to deal with those issues, so the gist of the question is, so the questioner works for a regulatory agency in the UK that has jurisdiction over financial services. They've been doing some randomized controlled trials testing different reforms to disclosure in financial services markets. And the basic finding is it's hard to make any difference in behavior or beliefs. Do you test beliefs as well, or is it behavior?
I think we have had some changes in beliefs, but again, pretty small.
Small changes in beliefs, some even smaller, presumably, changes in actual choices. But they had some successes with summary measure or summary disclosures and the like. The question then is how to take on the challenge that I posed at the end of the talk. That is, how should we evaluate the benefits and costs of the effective disclosures? And so one possibility is for the analyst in the regulatory agency or as an academic, for the analyst to adopt a strong theoretical perspective on the issue. So if it's a credit market that we're regulating, which is a classic example that Warren talked about at length, we have a well-developed set of theories for the credit market. So on the consumer side, the key idea that drives those theories is the idea of diminishing margin utility from consumption. That's sort of the workhorse assumption that drives a desire to, for example, smooth consumption over one's lifetime, to smooth consumption over states of the world, and so forth. And if you adopt that strong view, and that's an a priori theoretical commitment, you can then use that to make some progress. You can calibrate those models with evidence, as David Laibson and others have done in various contexts, and then use the preference parameters that are the most likely ones given the data, and you're gonna use a model that's rich enough to accommodate mistakes, and there are a set of such models, to then do welfare analysis on how to think about the costs and benefits. There are some contexts which I think this is actually fairly straightforward. So the example I would give where I think it's perhaps easiest is on the portfolio design side. So people allocate their investment portfolios in all sorts of crazy ways, right? There's a big literature on how people design their own portfolios. We have a very well-developed normative theory of portfolio design from financial economics, modern portfolio theory. And it gives us some nice results, like people shouldn't bear diversifiable risk because they won't be compensated for it. So if you buy into that theoretical framework, then that provides at least some set of results that would help us do welfare analysis on regulations, disclosure, and other that would affect how people allocate their portfolios. So if you see people moving toward the frontier, the risk-return frontier, through that disclosure intervention, then that's welfare improving. And that's only a partial. But these are hard. This is like the big issue in my view, the big methodological issue in the sort of behavioral law and economics space. And so I appreciate that my response is unsatisfactory. I think the field doesn't yet have a satisfactory methodology that's general.
Jim, can I just
Absolutely.
on this? So once you've moved away from the model of disclosures, just providing information in a system 2 type way, and this is a mode of thinking where you don't really need to know anything about preferences. But once you moved away from this and you're doing the type of disclosure that, we're looking at effects on behavior and we're doing system 1 disclosures, then it seems like the disclosure technique, regulatory technique, is not really any different in terms of what we need to do to evaluate it from a social welfare perspective than, a price cap or any other modes of very hard regulations. These are the same problems. In all of them, we need to figure out preferences and to figure out whether this is good or bad. So disclosure does not have this unique place anymore that it had under the neoclassical System 2 deliberation model.
Question for you. So in RCTs in medicine, it's clear that there's some sort of objective, measurable outcome or optimal outcome that you would want for the patients. But in law, what would that be? Would it be a more nuanced, evidence-based, theory of judicial equity? Would it be a reduced recidivism? Is it more of a theoretical, furtherance you want in your RCTs, or is it a practical one?
Yeah.
So the question is, is the comparison to law and medicine actually fair, or is it useful? And one aspect that you might think about is, in medicine, we all sort of want to return to health. And there is a reasonably well-accepted way of saying this is the goal. And actually, that's one of the reasons that one of the things, we agree with you on that up to a point. And it's one of the reasons that we're positing might explain some of the differences between the two fields, because it suggests that because folks in medicine don't have to think about the goal, they know what the goal is, they become problem solvers from the get-go. Bit of a stretch, not my favorite, but something to it. I guess what I'd say is, in law, it turns out that one can often find the goals from the purveyors of the program, from the runners of the program, once you interview them. The conversations that I have had in order to do this, in order to get the RCTs off the ground, because in order to do them, I need to know what to measure. Right? If I don't have a goal, I don't have a clue what I'm supposed to measure. Those tend to be quite difficult conversations, and where I've gotten some of the most pushback which is, of course we know this is doing good. And you say, well, what does good mean? It turns out if you question, if you cross-examine, you can ordinarily tend to get the good that the policymaker or the purveyor or the judge or the lawyer thinks is coming from the program. It varies from setting to setting. So a lawyer, a legal aid organization might have the goal of winning cases. That should not be a judge's goal, right? And so a policy, a program, might have different purposes depending on where you're sitting. I'm not sure how different that is in medicine. if you dive deep into the way that medicine organizes itself, and this is one of the criticisms of medicine, which is the kidney doctor fixes the kidney problem, but then causes the liver problem, and now you got to go fix the liver problem. In other words, you get this compartmentalization, and we don't. And I guess the one major difference is that maybe in law we think that the actors should not actually be compatible with each other, whereas in medicine we want all the doctors we want to try to further and return the patient to health via some definition, but we actually don't think that the public defenders and the prosecutors should have that many common goals. They all have some big picture, broad common goal, but so I guess I'm agreeing with your question in part and still saying it's possible to tease out the goals of, if you have very difficult conversations with members of the bench and the bar, that they quite frankly resist, especially up front. So, yes, ma'am.
So I'm not a psychologist, but I'm going to try to venture in here and see if I can get a question in there that makes sense. I'm in finance economics, but we look at cognitive issues sometimes in finance, in fact more and more often in finance and economics. And it seems to me this difference between medicine and law, that there could be an input question there, the types of people that are going to be drawn to law and the types of people who are going to be drawn to medicine, for instance, may have very different need for cognitive closure themselves. So, right, both of these disciplines require some cognitive closure. The client, if you will, whether it's a patient or whether it's someone looking for a legal answer, is looking for cognitive closure. They're looking for an answer. They're hoping it's the right answer, but they're really hoping it's the answer they want to hear as well. And so there's a sort of a different tension in the two different disciplines about what the right answer would be and what constitutes a right answer or an answer that someone wants to hear. And you were just talking about that in medicine we know it's about restoring to health. In law, there's more ambiguity, I think, in what that goal is. But on the input side, if you not only have a client, if you will, that needs cognitive closure, but the person drawn to that field also has a very high need for cognitive closure. So just supposing people who tend toward law have a higher need for cognitive closure themselves than people who tend toward medicine as a profession, you'll get a less scientific, if you will, even all else the same, I think you'll get a less scientific field. And I just think it would be interesting to pose the question and see if you could study that, what types of people are drawn to these two different professions, because that could be a real input enhancer if you could figure out how to do something when they're still in training toward this. The other piece of that I think is related is once they're in there, regardless of who the profession drew, what are the differences in the cognitive process that's allowed or even encouraged when they're trying to do the problem solving. So if I'm a lawyer, how much am I encouraged by my own peers to sit around a table with them? They may not even be in my firm, but sit around a table with them and explore what the different possible answers are to the question being asked, as opposed to in medicine, what the acceptability is or even the encouragement is to sit around and kind of group think or get lots of input on what the answer may be.
So there's a lot there. Let me just try to summarize a couple of pieces of it. I'm not going to be able to summarize the whole question, but part of it, one suggestion is to think about when we're trying to figure out why medicine and law might have different roles for the RCT in their professional epistemology. Think about the type of people that go into the two fields. And maybe there is a particular need for professional closure, more of a need among the legal folks than there is among the medical folks, because again, perhaps the goals in the medical profession are more easily defined. And I guess my reaction to that up front, the first reaction is I actually don't think, I'm skeptical a little bit of it, because it feels like that once you've had the difficult conversation with the members of the legal profession, they are very committed to the particular goal, and it's more a question of the certainty of how do you get from here to there, that they resist. In other words, they know the right answer, they know it's working, and so it's a question of how it is that they know that, and the things that count in terms of what's true. That feels like it's more, at least on the qualitative part of this that I've done. That's more front and center. But in terms of the type of people, in terms of looking at the type of people that go into the two professions, I mean, I've had people see this research and say, it's just because lawyers don't like math. That's it, right? That's all you really need to know. And in fact, we brag about it in the legal profession. Let me tell you how bad I am at math. That's considered a badge of honor in the legal profession. Whereas it's considered to be a little bit stigmatizing in the medical profession. I guess what makes, when I react to that, what makes me want to say is, what is it about the structure of the two professions that would cause us to brag in law and not cause us to brag in medicine? It's not enough to, it's like saying medicine is a science and law isn't, but that was a self-conscious choice on the part of the medical profession. So I think we've got time for one more question. Yes, sir.
So the legal profession is starting to adopt data analytics, right? Looking at big databases and pulling information out of them. Do you, anybody in the panel, but I think Jim is probably directed at you, do you think that that trend may also spark a desire for more RCTs?
So the question is, what's the relationship between law's somewhat recent turn towards big data analytics and is there reason for optimism with respect to the RCT? And I guess my answer is cautiously perhaps, but I'm actually not that optimistic that that's going to help. And the reason is because at least the resistance that I have encountered has not been towards looking to things in the past. That's absolutely fine. If you can pull the data and analyze it, they'll learn from it. The resistance is to the idea that that may not get you all the way there, especially when you're talking about an intervention or a program, and that really what you have to do is to subject people to a different state, to different states of the world. From the judges, this gets articulated in terms of an equality norm, equal protection principle, whatever you want to say. From the lawyers, it gets articulated in terms of ethics, that it would be unethical to deny somebody my program that I know works. And thus, you're back, wait a minute, how do you know it worked, right? And so, what else? I have not encountered resistance at all towards toward retrospective studies, towards observational studies. And those have been around to some extent in the legal profession. It's really the prospective and the randomization that really drives people up the wall. So with that, regrettably, we're going to need to end. Thank you so much to the panelists. Terrific.
Ultra-Orthodox schools demand exemptions from laws that require them to teach students a basic curriculum of math, science, and English, claiming that these subjects conflict with religious education. So how to solve these conflicts is a pressing item on many lawmakers' agenda. So these are all salient examples. Can behavioral science help overcoming these conflicts? So in recent years, behavioral scientists have become increasingly more engaged with this question and also have begun to outline some of the main barriers to conflict resolution and even unearth some promising interventions. And this is a really relatively new field of research, and there is still much work ahead of us. So today I want to focus on just one key idea, and that is that affirming people's values has the potential to mitigate norm conflicts and encourage peaceful resolution. And because this might sound a little bit counterintuitive, before I discuss some several examples, let me first say a little bit more about the concept of affirmation. So in social psychology, affirmation refers to conditions that increase individuals' sense of self-worth, identity, and narrative. In the lab, affirmation is often achieved through asking individuals to identify and then write about values that are personally important to them. Stanford's Jeffrey Cohen, who pioneered much of this work, finds that individuals who are reminded of their big picture values like family and friendship in this way often feel more confident and more empowered. As a result, they become more open to evidence and arguments that challenge their beliefs, more pragmatic, and when they negotiate with the other side, they also achieve more practical gains and compromise more. So how do these important findings relate to these conflicts of norms and values I opened with? So at the heart of many of these conflicts is a concept we call identity threat. Yielding to a norm that stands against your central beliefs and values risks your sense of identity and can also harm your ties with the community that you care about the most. As part of my research, I interviewed Catholics in the US and Jewish Orthodox in Israel. And what I often hear from these people is that what troubles them most about the laws they're fighting against is not necessarily the specific legal requirement to provide contraceptive coverage or teach math at school, but how they perceive these laws as posing a bigger threat to their religious identity. For example, I find that many ultra-Orthodox parents would actually like to educate their children in math and science, but they fear that what the government is actually getting at, attempting to do at least, is to eradicate their unique religious identity. And what the theory of affirmation then teaches us is to overcome these norm conflicts, people may need to feel that their identity is assured and that solutions to the conflict are not imposed on them. To make difficult decisions, they need to feel affirmed. In one revealing example in the context of international conflicts, social psychologists find that self-affirmed Israelis and Serbs were significantly more likely to acknowledge responsibility for in-group wrongdoing and to support reparations from victims for the other side. In my own research on religion-based conflict, I found that affirmation by the government can do a great deal to mitigate religious identity threats. So in one such experiment I'm going to describe now that I conducted in Israel, several hundreds of ultra-Orthodox participants read one of several versions of a government letter addressed to an ultra-Orthodox school containing details of the math and science curriculum, alongside a reminder that failing to teach this curriculum would result in budget cuts. The control version was adapted from formal government documents and used the same heavy-handed language that the government currently uses. The affirmation version added only a few extra words, but these words slightly changed the tone of the letter to acknowledge the identity of the school and the value of religious studies next to science. Participants in both conditions were asked whether they would support their children's school teaching the curriculum and whether they think that the school would actually teach it. The study had two important findings. First, as expected, many ultra-Orthodox participants want schools to teach the science curriculum. For the moderates in the ultra-Orthodox community, affirmation didn't matter much at all. They want the curriculum under both conditions. But for the conservatives, the group that is least likely to accept the curriculum, affirmation made a big difference. 100% of this group refused to accept the teaching of the curriculum in the control condition, but 50% thereof were between neutral and higher towards support in the affirmation condition. And what's interesting about it is that we might have expected affirmed individuals to become actually more hardline and entrenched in their positions, but the opposite occurs instead. They become more open to the policy and to the law change. The simple takeaway message is this: while there is still much research to be done for interventions that could mitigate norm conflicts, whenever identity threat is on the line, affirmation is definitely one solution worth trying. Thank you.
Law. So in a sense, if a lot of the bad things that we see are actually done by good people, what are the changes we need to do in law, in the theory, in terms of people's moral agency, responsibility, how should we treat choice, and in terms of kind of the interventions, the regulation, enforcement. If someone doesn't feel that they're doing anything wrong, obviously, for example, increasing the punishment is not likely to change the behavior of someone thinking, I'm not the corrupt person thereafter. So I think to understand why behavioral ethics is not that important in law, I think it's related to the contribution of economics. And I think in a sense, I'm calling it the double-edged sword of economics. Without economics, law and psychology, I think, will still focus on things like child custody, insanity defense, which are very important topics, but are not usually relevant for most type of people, and usually leaving private law, public law, many kind of the aspects of law outside the reach of psychology. So I think economics has done really great in that regard, but it also comes with a cost. And for example, if we think of something like self-serving biases, because of the dominance of economics in law, self-serving usually will focus on how people will overestimate the probability of winning rather than on people actually not figuring out that they did anything wrong, which I think is a more fundamental aspect of law. We should also say that in contrast to the more traditional behavioral economics, behavioral ethics is not as developed. So there are many important issues that are still kind of debatable in the current research about people's awareness. Can they actually change their behavior, and kind of the distribution of good and bad people in society? And just kind of one of the many questions that we still don't know. And the question is, should we wait for the field to kind of be more established? And in a sense, the argument, or this is the, what I'm trying to say, that we cannot, but you just need to do it more carefully. A related point is kind of, okay, now that we say that ethicality is important, I think we need to recognize that lawyers should play a kind of bigger role in the kind of behavioral insight teams that are emerging now in many countries, in a sense that if you're only trying to kind of help people save more for pension, you could say that maybe you don't need kind of the legal background, but if you think of things like corruption, I think the normative issues are much greater. We also need to recognize that you cannot really take the cheating experiments that we see in behavioral ethics, you cannot really translate them directly to law without recognizing that people's decision to not obey the law, to comply, and all those things related to various legal instruments are different than cheating, and there is a work to be done to kind of think how to translate what we know about cheating to compliance, and I will demonstrate it in one slide at the end. I think there is a very big difference between ethical nudges and kind of traditional nudges, in a sense that when it comes to ethical nudges, people, in a sense, like to be in some sort of an ignorance about their wrongdoing. So the nudge is not really in their self-interest. When you focus on nudges in people's health, people want to be healthy, so the nudge helps them do something they also are interested in. There are very many, I think, many important differences between what states can do and what organizations do, what they care about, what's their interest. And this is just the illustration that I made. Here I can see. I can see on this screen. Oh, great. So I'm going to speak about, in a sense, a chapter from a forthcoming book. It's called The Law of Good People, and I'm going to speak about the neglected role of behavioral ethics within the behavioral analysis.
Try the keyboard.
The other way around? Oh, okay. Oh, probably the Hebrew English. Okay. The behavioral analysis of law, we're basically challenging the rational choice perspective in law on a few grounds. We have, I think, the most famous one is kind of the Tversky and Kahneman, cognition, the whole biases, and heuristic literature. We have the legitimacy, I think mostly with Tom Tyler's work, that people care about procedure, not just about outcomes. And we have kind of people who not just care about their own self-interest, but also about others. And in a sense, I want to argue that there is a huge literature, it's a growing one in management and in psychology, which is kind of the blind spot, bounded ethicality, a different strand of this behavioral ethics focus on self-deception, self-maintenance, more kind of deliberative processes. But in a sense, it's kind of focusing on people's inability to fully capture their own wrongdoing as something which should be a very central component of the behavioral analysis law. But it seems that although it's really growing and being very successful in management and in psychology, it's not, and you can see kind of how many books on these kind of issues in psychology and management, you don't see that happening in law. And I think this literature really creates a lot of normative and prescriptive challenges for law. For example, if you have egotism, so is that a conflict of interest for someone to interview someone with the same first name? or if you think about moral forgetting. So when you talk about responsibility, and the work suggests that people are more likely to forget rules which are not in line with their self-interest. We have in law this notion that if two people sign a document, it makes it more likely or less likely to be fraud, but we have behavioral ethics research suggest people might be more likely to cheat when they do it together. Rational choice expects that people will cheat more for themselves. You might be getting the gain for being corrupted in a sense, but the research suggests again that you will do more corrupt things for others. There is overwhelming evidence, and really don't have the time to develop it, that system one, that is the idea that people are not really aware of what's motivating them, is actually a huge component in people's ethical behavior. Situation matters, we know from social psychology, but I think, again, behavioral ethics making really nice kind of illustrations of how really small tweaks in a situation can affect people's ethicality. And again, it's created a lot of challenges for.
So everybody, welcome to the session on law. We are going to follow a modified super fast TED Talk format today. So we have a very full panel. We have 6 speakers. Include 5 there and plus 1. And we're going to have 3 8-minute talks in the order that we're going to follow the order in my introduction, and then stop for 15 minutes of questions about those talks. We'll then have 3 more 8-minute talks, stop for 15 minutes of questions specific to those talks. If we are efficient, and I'm hoping to keep us efficient and on time, then we'll have a couple of minutes at the end to ask questions for the whole panel. Okay, so welcome. Thank you so much for coming. Netta's going to lead us off. So Netta, lead us off.
So I hope I get it right. So thanks, Jim, and good morning, everyone. Today I want to talk about law, norm conflicts, and behavioral insights. So we live in a world in which values and norms constantly conflict, even in Western, democratic, and generally pluralistic societies. So just during the past year, we've seen several such highly publicized examples. So we've seen the conflict over same-sex marriage here in the US evolving into businesses refusing service, businesses in the wedding industry, to gay couples, and even a county clerk refusing to register these marriages. In both these instances, religious norms and beliefs conflict with anti-discrimination law and norms. A recent Supreme Court decision left hanging another very lengthy norm conflict in which religious employers refuse to comply with a law that requires employee health care policies to include contraceptive coverage. And the questions that arise from this case are particularly interesting from a behavioral perspective, because at least at this point in the dispute, all parties seem to agree that the government should afford some accommodation to religious employers, but the crucial question that we seem to not be getting right time and time again is what accommodation can actually work to satisfy both the compelling interest of the government in ensuring equal and free health care to all women and the religious concerns on complicity in sin. So while many of these conflicts pit competing beliefs and norms about gender and sexuality, the scope of conflict is even broader than that. So we also know conflicts about and over education, including teaching the evolution or creationism. And in Israel, Britain, and Belgium, Jewish